sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at a story that really kind of, I think, shook up the political landscape, at least in Washington. The confirmation of Pete Hegseth as the new defense secretary.
Oh, yeah.
You might be thinking, okay, new cabinet appointment, what's the big deal? But this one was not your typical confirmation hearing and cabinet appointment.
Definitely not typical. And I think one of the biggest things that makes this so intriguing is the fact that it was such a close vote.
Yeah.
It came down to a 50-50 tie in the Senate. And Vice President JD Vance actually had to step in and cast the deciding vote.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, that level of contention right out of the gate, you know, that means we've got a lot to dig into here.
There's a lot to unpack here. And to kind of understand why this was so explosive, I think we need to look at it from a couple of different angles. First, let's just talk about his background.
Sure.
I mean, we're talking about a former Fox News host.
Right.
Stepping into one of the most demanding roles, I think, in government.
Arguably.
Arguably, yeah. And that's not your typical path to becoming defense secretary.
No, not at all. You're absolutely right
Yeah.
to point that out. I mean, the role of defense secretary is so much more than just politics.
Right.
You're talking about leading the largest military in the world, crafting military strategy with incredibly high stakes.
Yeah.
You know, navigating the complexities of international relations.
It's a huge job.
Really is, yeah. And it demands, I think, a level of expertise and a nuanced understanding of global affairs that it goes way beyond, partisan talking points.
Right. So how do you think his background, or maybe lack thereof in certain areas, might play into all this?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at past defense secretaries, you see, people who often have deep experience in government or military affairs, foreign policy. You know, they've had to grapple with really complex issues, make tough calls, navigate all the intricacies of international diplomacy. And, that's just not something you can really pick up overnight.
No. And, you had 3 Republican senators, including Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell,
Right.
breaking rank to vote against him.
Right.
What do you think was going through their minds when they made that decision?
Well, it's certainly not common
Right.
to see that level of dissent within a party.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to a cabinet appointment. So that suggests to me that McConnell and the other dissenting Republicans had some serious concerns, maybe about Hegseth's ability to do the job. They might have been concerned about his qualifications, his political leanings, or even, the controversies that have surrounded him over the years.
Yeah, let's talk about those controversies, because I think those definitely added fuel to the fire.
Oh, yeah.
He's been open about, his infidelity in the past, and there's allegations of sexual assault that have been made against him, which he denies.
Right.
But how do you think, that these personal issues might impact his ability to lead and command respect within the military?
Well, I think they raise some really big questions.
Yeah.
You've got someone who's, the defense secretary is in charge of, leading a military of over 2 million people. They need to embody the values of integrity and honor and accountability.
Yeah.
And, it's also essential, I think, for a defense secretary to maintain a strong public image.
Yeah.
Especially on the international stage. So these controversies, they could potentially undermine Hegseth's authority, his credibility, both within the military and, in the eyes of the world.
Right. And McConnell released a pretty, scathing statement outlining his reasons for opposing Hegseth.
Yeah, he did.
He didn't hold back.
Not at all.
He even said, and I'm quoting here, he said, "The most consequential cabinet official in any administration is the Secretary of Defense." It seems like he was trying to send a message, not just to the president, but to the country.
Well, I think it was more than just a disagreement.
Yeah.
It was a very public rebuke of the president's choice. It's really rare for someone like McConnell in his position to do something like that.
Yeah.
And I think it makes you wonder what's really going on behind the scenes. It definitely revealed some of the, I think, growing divisions within the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And, that could have significant consequences for, national security policy down the line.
And he also said that Hegseth failed to articulate in any detail a strategic vision for dealing with the gravest long-term threat emanating from China. Do you think it's possible to be an effective defense secretary without a clear plan for addressing the challenges posed by China's rise as a global power?
I think that's a really great question. And I think it gets to the heart of what it means to be defense secretary in the 21st century. You know, we live in a complex, interconnected world. The threats we face are constantly evolving. You know, a strong military, it's crucial.
Sure.
But it's not enough on its own.
So what else is needed?
Right.
Like what specific qualities or skills should a defense secretary possess to handle these increasingly complex challenges?
I think they need a deep understanding of geopolitics,
Okay.
economics, technology. They need to be able to build strong alliances with other countries. And I think most importantly, they need a strategic vision
Right.
that can adapt to a rapidly changing world.
So how does Hegseth measure up against those criteria? Let's maybe start by digging into his vision or lack thereof when it comes to dealing with China. I mean, as you mentioned, this is particularly important because China's growing influence is arguably the biggest geopolitical challenge facing the U.S. right now. So you mentioned that, he hasn't really laid out a concrete plan for addressing the challenges posed by China. I'm curious, what are some of the specific issues or flashpoints that he's going to have to tackle as defense secretary when it comes to dealing with China?
Oh, there are a number of areas where things could get really dicey. For starters, there's the issue of Taiwan.
Right.
China has repeatedly stated its intention to reunify with Taiwan, even if it means using force.
Right.
And the U.S. has a longstanding commitment to support Taiwan's defense.
Yeah.
So if China were to actually make a move on Taiwan, I mean, it would put the U.S. in an incredibly difficult position.
Yeah. So if you were advising Hegseth right now, what would you say are the most important considerations when it comes to developing a strategy for dealing with China?
Well, I think the first step is to really acknowledge the complexity of the situation.
Okay.
China is not a monolithic entity.
Right.
There are different factions within the Chinese government, each with their own priorities and agendas. And the Chinese people themselves have a wide range of views on, issues like Taiwan, the South China Sea.
So it sounds like you're saying we can't just treat China as like a single adversary with a single set of goals.
Right.
We need to really understand the nuances of their political system and their society in order to really develop an effective strategy.
Exactly. And it's not just about, military might. We need to think about economic leverage, diplomatic engagement, and even cultural exchange.
Yeah.
It's a multifaceted challenge that requires, a multifaceted approach.
And this kind of brings us back to McConnell's critique of Hegseth's emphasis on, warrior culture.
Right.
I know we touched on this earlier, but I think it's worth exploring a bit further. Can you maybe explain what he means by warrior culture and why some people are concerned about it?
Sure. So when Hegseth talks about warrior culture, he seems to be emphasizing, kind of these more traditional military values like courage, discipline, a willingness to fight.
Right.
He's talked about wanting to instill, kind of a more aggressive mindset within the military. Now, on the surface, there's nothing inherently wrong with wanting a strong and capable military.
Right, sure.
But
it feels like there's a but coming.
But yeah, some people worry that this emphasis on warrior culture could lead to a more militaristic foreign policy where we're quicker to resort to force rather than diplomacy.
Okay.
They argue that it could undermine our efforts to, build alliances and cooperate with other countries.
I see. So it's not necessarily the idea of a warrior culture itself that's the problem. It's how it's interpreted and applied in the context of foreign policy.
Exactly. It's about finding the right balance, I think, between, strength and restraint, between, military power and diplomatic engagement. And, that's a delicate balance to strike, especially in today's world.
Right. And I think this ties into another concern that McConnell raised, which was Hegseth's lack of experience in dealing with this complex world of international relations.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit more about why that experience is so crucial for a defense secretary, especially when we're talking about, navigating these sensitive issues like the ones we've been discussing with China?
Well, diplomacy is a subtle art.
Right.
It requires a deep understanding of history and culture and politics.
Mm-hmm.
It requires patience, tact, the ability to build relationships with people from very different backgrounds.
Yeah.
And it often involves making difficult compromises and finding common ground, even when there are really fundamental disagreements.
So it sounds like you're saying that being a successful defense secretary requires more than just, military expertise.
Absolutely.
You need to be a skilled diplomat, a strategic thinker, a master communicator.
I think that's right. The defense secretary is not just a warrior, they're a statesman. They represent the United States on the world stage. Their words and actions have the power to shape, global events. And they need to be able to navigate that complex landscape with wisdom and skill.
And that makes his lack of experience in this area all the more concerning, especially given the high-stakes challenges he's going to be facing.
It's definitely something to keep an eye on. How he approaches these challenges will have a significant impact, I think, on the future of, U.S. foreign policy.
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the actual confirmation process itself.
Right.
I mean, a 50-50 tie in the Senate with Vice President having to cast the deciding vote.
Okay.
You don't see that every day.
Very rare.
The political nail biter.
Mm-hmm.
What does this really dramatic confirmation vote tell us about the current political climate in Washington?
Well, I think it's a clear indication of just how divided Washington is right now. I mean, the fact that 3 Republicans were willing to break ranks and vote against their own party's nominee, I think speaks volumes about the level of distrust and just partisan gridlock that exists.
Yeah. And it's not just Republicans versus Democrats.
Right.
We're seeing, growing divisions within the Republican Party itself. There's a faction that's very loyal to the president, and then there's this other faction that's more, traditional establishment, maybe more wary of the president's agenda.
Exactly. And those divisions were on full display, I think, during this confirmation process. McConnell, in particular, he represents that more traditional wing of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And his decision to publicly oppose Hegseth was a bold move. And it suggests that, he's willing to stand up to the president when he believes it's necessary.
This whole situation with Hegseth's confirmation kind of reminds me of another recent cabinet appointment that was also incredibly contentious. That of Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education back in 2017.
Oh, right. Yeah.
That vote also went down to the wire and required a tiebreaker from the vice president.
Yeah, that's a great comparison.
Yeah.
DeVos, like Hegseth, had very little experience in the area she was appointed to lead. She was a wealthy donor to the Republican Party, strong ideological beliefs, but she lacked the practical knowledge and experience that many people felt were essential for the job.
Right.
And her confirmation sparked a huge backlash, with teachers' unions and education advocates protesting across the country.
And it's interesting to see how those kinds of, political battles can play out over time.
Yeah.
In DeVos' case, her lack of experience and her controversial policies, they led to a lot of turmoil and instability within the Department of Education.
Yeah.
It took years for the department to recover from her tenure.
It's a really important point. These cabinet appointments aren't just about who occupies a particular office for a few years. They have long-term consequences, for the institutions they lead and, the people they serve.
I'm curious, do you think, the public is fully aware of the potential consequences of these appointments? It's easy to get, I think, caught up in the political drama of the moment.
Right.
But do you think people really understand how these decisions can actually impact their lives?
That's a great question. I think it's easy for people to feel disconnected from these political processes.
Yeah.
Especially when they're presented as these kind of abstract battles in Washington. But the reality is that, these decisions have real world consequences, for everyone. The policies enacted by the Department of Defense, they affect our national security, our economy, and even our personal freedoms.
So what can we as citizens do to ensure that these appointments are made with the best interests of the country in mind? How can we make our voices heard and hold our elected officials accountable?
Well, I think the most important thing is to just stay informed and engaged.
Okay.
Pay attention to what's happening in Washington. Learn about the candidates who are being nominated for these positions and, reach out to your elected officials to express your concerns.
And don't be afraid to speak out.
Well, yeah.
Even if you feel like your voice is small,
Yeah.
It's important to add it to the chorus.
That's right.
The more people who are engaged in these issues, the more likely it is that our leaders will make decisions that that reflect the will of the people.
Absolutely. Our democracy depends on an informed and active citizenry. And the more we understand about these issues, the better equipped we'll be to, make informed choices and hold our leaders accountable.
Well said. So we've talked about, Hegseth's background, the controversies that surround him, his lack of a clear strategy for dealing with China, and the political firestorm his confirmation created. But there's another, I think, really important piece of the puzzle that we need to examine, which is Hegseth's vision for the U.S. military itself. So we've talked about his lack of experience. We talked about warrior culture. But what does he actually want to do with the military? Like, what are his specific goals and priorities for the Department of Defense?
Well, that's where things get a little bit murky. I mean, he's been very vocal about the need to strengthen the military, to project American power on the world stage.
Okay.
He's talked about increasing defense spending, modernizing weapons systems, and taking, a more assertive stance against our adversaries, particularly China and Russia.
Mm-hmm.
But he hasn't really provided, a lot of detail on how he actually plans to achieve those goals.
Right. So it's one thing to say, we need a stronger military, but it's another to actually figure out how to make that happen. What are some of the key decisions he's going to have to make as defense secretary? Like what are the levers he can pull, so to speak? Well,
I think one of the biggest decisions he'll face is how to allocate, the Pentagon's massive budget.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah, it's huge.
He'll need to decide which programs to fund, which weapon systems to prioritize, and how to balance the needs of, different branches of the military.
And I imagine those decisions will be influenced by his overall strategic vision, which, as we've discussed, seems to be a bit unclear at this point.
Exactly. I mean, if he's prioritizing, a more confrontational approach to China, for example, that might lead to, increased investments in naval power, long-range missiles. But on the other hand, if he's focused on, counterterrorism, stability operations in the Middle East, that might lead to very different spending priorities.
Right. It sounds like there's a lot riding on these decisions. How might his budget priorities actually affect the lives of everyday Americans?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the decisions made at the Pentagon, they have a ripple effect, throughout the economy. I mean, defense spending creates jobs, in manufacturing, technology, research.
Mm-hmm.
It also influences, the development of new technologies that can then have applications in the civilian sector.
Right.
So the choices he makes, will have a direct impact on the economy, on innovation, and ultimately on the lives of all Americans.
And it's not just about money, right?
Yeah.
He'll also be making decisions that, could potentially send American men and women into harm's way.
Yeah.
That's an enormous responsibility.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, he'll be the one advising the president on whether or not to use military force, where to deploy troops, and how to conduct military operations. And those decisions, have life or death consequences.
Yeah.
Both for our military personnel and for the civilians who are impacted by conflict.
It's a lot to process.
It is.
We got a new defense secretary with an unconventional background, a lot of unanswered questions, and a world that seems to be getting more complex and dangerous by the day.
Yeah, no, it can feel pretty overwhelming. But I think it's important to remember that we as citizens have a role to play in all of this. We can't just sit back and passively accept whatever decisions are made in Washington.
So what can we do? Like, how can we as individuals make a difference in a system that can, often feel so vast and impersonal?
Well, I think first and foremost, we need to stay informed. We need to understand the issues at stake, the different perspectives on those issues, and the potential consequences of the choices our leaders make. We can't hold our leaders accountable if we don't understand, what they're doing. And
beyond staying informed, how else can we make our voices heard? I mean, how could we ensure that our concerns are taken seriously by those in power?
I think, engage with your elected officials. Let them know what you think about the issues that matter to you. Participate in town halls, write letters, make phone calls, and use social media to amplify your voice.
And I think it's also important to support organizations that are working to promote peace, diplomacy, and responsible foreign policy.
Absolutely.
There are a lot of groups out there that are doing, incredible work to educate the public, advocate for change, and hold our leaders accountable.
Yeah, and don't underestimate the power of conversation. Talk to your friends, your family, your colleagues about these issues. Share your thoughts, listen to their perspectives, and engage in respectful dialogue. I think the more we talk about these issues, the more likely it is that we'll find common ground and work together to create, a more peaceful and just world.
Well said. I think
Okay.
you've given our listeners a lot to think about today.
I hope so. I mean, this is a critical moment in history. The decisions made in Washington will have a profound impact, I think, on the world for years to come. And it's up to all of us to stay informed, engaged, and committed to creating a better future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. Remember, the more you know, the more empowered you are to make a difference.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.